Okay, so let's go over the top 20 albums of January. I mean, it was actually a pretty decent January if we consider, the post COVID or the continuing COVID years have not been kind to the winter months lately. Uh, so basically, up front, no big rant or any real big reflections here at the start of the year. Uh, More that um, generally that the YouTube channel exists and all that. I haven't really talked about it much on the site, but there's a lot of things that I'm working on for the new year that I don't want to detail too much because if you overpromise, it's always kind of annoying. But there'll be new graphics for the rubric instead of using the star system and the 100, out of 100. So the rating system will change because I find it annoying when people focus on the number and not the reasoning behind it. And then I'll be doing a pretty extensive revision of an exhaustive study in melodic black metal, which will involve some interviews, some in-depth uh, coverage, of basically going back to the beginning of melodic black metal and going all the way up to probably about 2005. We'll see how far that goes. Um, and then there's again there's other things going on, but we'll get there when we get there. Um, so we there's really no contest here for album of the month. It's Thy Darkened Shades, Liber Lucifer, to Mahaprila out on World Terror Committee, and uh, yeah, I don't think there's really any contest for. This is probably the one like kind of great work to come out of January. There's really nothing else out that touched it. I think that Sem Jaza and his work on this album, uh, there's a lot of justification for why this took so long to come out, and it is a fine. I would call it a great work in black death metal. Again, spiritually a black metal album, and indicative of that throughout for its writing and style. And I could go on and on about it, but I already have. So I will just say that there's really nothing that came close to this in terms of quality, writing, performance, any of it. This was the best thing. Um, and if you heard something better this month, I'd love to hear about it. Uh, Number two is Lord Mountain's The Oath out on King Volume Records. This is just a very fine example of the ways that traditional doom metal, modern doom metal, epic heavy metal, and all kind of can come together in a really effective way. Um, you'll see people kind of comparing, like, there's a little bit of pallbearer, there's a little bit of, epic heavy metal. I don't generally agree with all those comparisons, but you do get the old with the new, and really it's the songs that sell it. It's a memorable experience. I think the style notes are just kind of like, we don't see this combination of elements done often or very well. So if you're a big fan of like Pagan Altar, but also you'll fully sit down and listen to like the first Pallbearer album, there's something in there for you on both ends of the spectrum. But I would consider this more of just kind of an epic heavy metal album in a lot of ways. But anyway, it's good. It's great. And I listen to it a ton, much more than I expected. Um, Trash Horns Into the Void is a short thrash metal album that focuses on kind of a Bay Area meets kind of German thrash metal, evil thrash metal side of things, and a little bit of Possessed in there too, for lack of a better example of the style of riffing that they throw in there to keep it fast and loose. And yeah, if you're a fan of classic thrash, this will fit right into your wheelhouse. Puts a little bit of an extreme spin on it, but no more than like the second Messiah record what it would have. So solid record. I'm still listening to it pretty often, and found it to be pretty quality for the amount of time that it took from like starting the band to the first record. This is a pretty impressive undertaking. Uh, the Inquisitor's apotheosis is, you know, one in a very long line of very consistent releases from this Danish death metal band. And these guys have history in sort of, you know, like war metal bands, black metal bands, and that kind of thing. And this is uh, their band to sort of approach old school death metal in their own way. And it has a very percussive, brutal quality to it, but it still reads as 90s influenced death metal. And I think in sort of in the best tradition where uh, the focus on uh, the tempo map really makes for a very interesting record that is a little bit unprecedented nowadays, where we don't have as many creative drummers in this sense who still appreciate the feeling of a death metal drum performance. And I think the record being produced to sound a little bit like a rehearsal or a real performance helps a lot in kind of achieving that traditional death metal feeling, but a unique one. Very raw, but not, you know, like unlistenable raw. More, it just feels a bit more real in space. So, uh, Profane Order's One Nightmare Unto Another is their second full length album, and yeah, I haven't finished the review for this one yet, but I can say that it's kind of they picked up the energy a little bit more on this one. It hits a lot faster, and the general thread that they present here, like I emphasized that this is a death metal leaning war metal album in some ways, but really it is a black death metal album in truth. It's just one that doesn't really have to compromise on either side of the spectrum, and it helps that the performances are just like really going for it, in terms of the drummer being fantastic and the vocalist kind of being a psycho on when he performs. And yeah, I've been stuck on it. I just haven't finished writing about it yet. Conjureth, the Parasitic Chambers is the second full-length album from this San Diego-based death metal band, and now we see a lot of '90s influenced death metal bands coming out and sort of flopping around with it. And I think the reason that Conjureth are so easily read and enjoyed is because they're more influenced by '80s death thrash and death metal in general. So it is technically death metal influenced death metal, but it's sort of like first generation death metal influenced death metal. So it does land closer to like the early '90s stuff for me on most of their releases. On this one, they've emphasized the flow and just outpouring of riffs as being the main reason why they're doing what they're doing, and that makes for a aggressive, almost death thrash feeling record that I would put in line with like a Monstrosity or like an early Sinister in a lot of ways. And they really just tunnel right through this record to start, and then towards the end, they mess around with some slower songs. There's a really great kind of death doom metal song at the end of the record that just tops it off in like this perfect way after all those just riff intensive kind of death thrashing songs. Um, Apocatastasis, the Consecratory Secretion, is the debut album from this Phoenix, Arizona based artist who has quickly um, really, I think, been experimenting with where, you know, the this album and what it would be for at least a year, and now has put together what I think is just a really impressive showing of not only the talent that he's developed for the sake of this project, but finding this interesting pathway between melodic black metal or melodic black death metal, if you will, and brutal death metal. And now he not only does he do this without ending up playing melodic death metal, but he does it with keyboards and doesn't make it sound like a bad, you know, death metal band heard Dimmu Borgir once. It's not that. And A big part of why this is effective for me is because his vocals sound a bit like the guy from Immolation. It has plenty of riffs, elegant melodies that are quite extended, and he nails the brutal death metal side of it very well. He has a brutal death metal project otherwise, and it definitely focuses on kind of the disgorge side of things. And so this it gives you uh, a different shade of those extremities in a pretty fantastic way. I found it very memorable and a lot of fun to listen to. So, Malice's The Fires of Heaven is their debut full length, and they are a black heavy metal, black thrash metal band out of Boston, and it's just a great record. I think that you'll definitely note the Bathory influences once you're done listening to the full thing. They have a little bit of a Hellhammer esque touch to some of the stuff they do, but most of it is just very. You know, if you want to listen to a black thrash metal record, you don't always expect it to have good thrash metal riffs and, you know, good speed metal riffs. You know, this is not like a Motorhead kind of dance around the fire kind of record. This is definitely an aggressive, straightforward record that leans into some longer, more extended pieces later on that help give it a nice, well-rounded character and a nice full listen. So I really appreciated the listening experience and a lot of the style that they're kind of messing around with here. Very good debut. Um, Iron Void is a British doom metal band, and Four is their fourth full-length album. And this finds them opening up their sound a little bit. Not it's not that they've escaped the realm of traditional doom metal. It's that they've expanded a lot of their influences into some more heavy rock and heavy psychedelic rock influences that you might find in, you know, Cathedral or Solstice. So it's not too far out of their wheelhouse to begin with, but we definitely hear a more expressive um, sound from the band, but also like their drummer they got for this one is really good, and it helps. They've developed these songs in really effective ways, as you'll find when you hit songs like "She" and all that, where you'll get it when you get there. Nothingness and Superliminal. Nothingness is a Minnesota based death metal band who deal in the abstract and right down to the way that they write songs. And basically, they're not named Nothingness for nothing. Uh, and that what I mean is that they pull what they can from their creative process naturally. And so where it lands, it lands. And they certainly develop these songs. It's one fellow who writes most of it, but uh, you can't really predict where they're going to go. Just by, you know, maybe there's some post hardcore or sludge influences and they're sort of latent interest, but it reads as kind of dissonant death metal interested, a little bit of black metal interest on some of the songs. There's a little bit of post hardcore on some of the songs, but all of it comes together as abstract, kind of avant garde death metal in a lot of ways. There are a few songs in here that'll just kind of generally surprise folks, even if you're kind of in the rhythm of the album. Once we get a little bit closer to the second half, you know, it's not as doom influenced as the previous record, but there are some curveballs in there anyway. So it's what I would call an emergent but sensical record where they do repeat parts. You know, it's not just a, you know, throw it down the stairs kind of record, but it's one that is, you're not going to sit down and necessarily memorize this record and get anything out of the pattern. It's more that it's the way that it feels and that it felt right in the moment, and that every time you pick it up, you might be a little bit surprised by it. There's might be something that's interesting in there. So I thought it was a cool thing, and I liked their first album, but I think they've just generally done better on this one. So it bodes well. Uh, Reburied is a Seattle, Washington area death metal band with members of some extreme doom metal bands you might know. I'm a big fan of Un, And so it was cool to see that those guys are in a death metal band, and Repulsive Nature is their debut. Now, this was one of those records where it's like, I listened to it once and I was like, all right, well, that was kind of fast. That was cool, you know. And then I went back the second time. I was like, this is actually pretty brutal. The rhythms are really well thought out. There's a kind of a string that they're committing to throughout the full listen that develops a little bit of maybe like a brutal death or grind influence touches here and there. There's a lot of old school death metal influence there, and it it's not quite a whirlwind. You know, it doesn't become nonsensical or like a blur, but there is a really fine amount of detail in the overall flow of this record that I really appreciated. So it's definitely kind of a surreal, interesting thing, but I was just impressed with the way that it all rolled together. Once I'd listened to it about 5 times, and it really stuck with me. So, um, Ominous Scriptures is a Ukrainian death metal quintet, a brutal death metal quintet, and you know, in terms of brutal death metal, most people consider this a mid-paced record. Um, even you know, in the same way that like late '90s, early 2000s, Morbid Angel was a little bit mid-paced. Uh, it's that they developed these songs in kind of definitely there's some Deeds of Flesh and some Discord influence. There is in like most good brutal death metal these days, but you feel the a classic era in this music that it really appealed to me up front. So once I'd sat down with it a few times, yeah, definitely you get the evolution of the band over the years, kind of centering on what they're really good at, and so there's this really effective, like I don't know, 30 plus minute record here. It sits. It might feel like it sits in that mid-pace spot, but what they do with it is kind of awesome. And I like I got this record, and then my computer got fried, so I didn't pick it up and it wasn't in my notes. So it'll take me like about a week to finish reviewing it because I'm about a week behind in covering it. But I wanted to put it on here because it's something I have been listening to, and I think it's exceptional. And I was kind of bummed that I missed reviewing it before the release date. Cursed Excruciation is a Brazilian black doom metal uh, project, and Arcane Diabolism is their debut full length. So, what this is, consider this somewhere nearby early Mystifier, and like Wicca, that kind of era, and that sort of Black Death, a little bit mid-paced sort of feeling with some of the mysticism you might get out of the early Greek black metal scene. And the big thing here is that this guy can write a riff. He actually does really well with doom metal riffs, and I think that all comes together for just like a pretty cool album. Um, if you were if you like the Necromant album that came out last year, which Iron Bonehead also put out, you'll enjoy this. And I think if you like uh, maybe a little Beharit in there too, there's a pretty good balance of like the bestial and the doom that I found myself listening to this quite a lot. And when I went in, I was not expecting much. Host Soul, uh, Long Live Doden, however you pronounce that, is a we could call this a pan Scandinavian project that includes members from Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and folks that you would recognize from Shining, Mains, and the drummer from Grave Pleasures is in the band too. So what they play is, I guess, what I would consider the old school definition of atmospheric black metal, which is a little bit it's more about tone than it is about fitting into the modern idea of what atmospheric black metal is, and it's heavily. I would find it a little bit similar to some of the work that the guitarist has done in Mains, in that it is again melodic, uh, and just flows together in a certain way, which is um, a little bit somber, um, and definitely focuses on intricate guitar melodies. But also the vocalist, of course, the vocalist from Shining is very expressive, and he kind of he doesn't necessarily steal the show, but he leads the feeling of the record in a lot of different directions that I found really effective. It was the kind of record that I put it on. I wasn't expecting, you know, too much from it, and it turned out to be one of my favorite and one of the more distinct black metal records from January. Tribunal is let's call it a gothic occult doom metal record or band from Victoria, British Columbia, Vancouver, British Columbia. And The Weight of Remembrance is their debut full length. I think it's their first release ever. And this one is pretty interesting because it'll make you uh, think of like gothic death doom metal to start, but there's actually like a black doom element to it. But the real core of the whole experience is the occult uh, rock slash doom metal or doom rock feeling of all of it. Now, the best songs on here that have the most personality do lean towards gothic doom metal ultimately, but this is very well fleshed out, very well developed, and just beautifully performed combination of those elements that should appeal to most doom metal fans, even if you do shrink away from the thought of a gothic doom metal album. I think there's a lot of interesting crossover appeal there, even if you don't need the gothic part of it to, or that just doesn't appeal to you, because it will appeal to people who are interested in traditional doom metal as well. So, New Jersey-based black speed metal band Gauntlet. A lot of people are calling this black and roll. I think that's ridiculous. Dark Steel and Fire is a pretty classic example of battery worship, and just an excellent album. It's memorable. He nailed the production sound. All the performances are great. The guy can write a riff. It's just exceptional. If you're a fan of early Bathory, just 80s in general, there's so much to like about this record, and it's catchy, it's memorable. There's a lot of cool songs in here, so easy to recommend. Cancervo is an Italian heavy psychedelic slash doom metal band, and one that have with this album they've shifted from an instrumental uh, stoner rock kind of band into a kind of gloomy, haunted doom metal feeling band with psychedelic rock influences. And all that means is that there's a very continuous mood to this record, and it's an eerie, kind of surreal feeling. Listen, one that I just enjoyed sitting with. It does feel a little bit like uh, linear with its ride, but they tell a story throughout, and it's got a lot of character if you're willing to sit with it and you like kind of the hypnotic side of doom metal. Um, Sonic Poison is a Finnish death grind or grindcore trio, and their debut full length has been a while in the making. Eruption is about a 20-something minute grindcore record that has death metal, crust punk, hardcore punk, and thrash metal influences. It's very much in the great tradition of 80s grindcore, as it sort of more seriously merged with death metal in the late 80s beyond Scum and from Obliteration, all that. So basically, if you like hardcore punk, if you like more raw side of thrash, if you like death thrash metal, this is a very classic sort of band that what if you like Terrorizer at all, you'll get this sound, and plenty more great examples of that sort of metal punk version of things. Vosbud, or however you pronounce that, their Hekluja album is a great combination of pagan black metal atmospheric black metal and post black metal. I don't really care about post black metal sleepiness, but the pagan black metal side of this band is quite good. The long epic black metal songs on this thing are great, and their shorter songs are even better. So this was just a great record that kind of surprised me, and I found it better with each listen. And finally, Anachronisms Meanders is number 20, and uh, not because it's any less good than anything above it. It's because I've spent less time with it. I haven't finished a review for it yet, but it is a technical death metal band out of Switzerland, and this is their third full-length album. And this one focuses on a little bit more on uh, taking some chances, experimenting a little bit more. It builds upon what they had done with Orogeny, their 2018 full length, and it digs into just different avenues, different levels of expression beyond kind of the dissonant and creeping side of technical death metal. So if you're a fan of Obscura, you'll probably enjoy some of these more experimental songs, and generally just kind of a great band. But I'll get around to finishing the review for it this weekend. So there you go. That's the top 20 albums of January. Still working on a few of them, but I've listened to them enough to have included them here. And yeah, just go read it and check them out.